All right, I'm going to go ahead and start. Welcome to the Journalist Resources first online training session of the year, using academic research to keep politicians honest. This is a presentation that I created based on my own experience in the newsroom for close to 20 years, covering a wide range of policy topics at the state, local, and federal level. And really, this presentation is meant to offer the kinds of tips and insights that I wish I had had back in the newsroom. So hopefully you'll be able to use all of this information right away to strengthen your coverage, but also to avoid some of the missteps that are pretty common in news coverage of policy topics. So this is me. My name is Denise Ordway, and I'm the managing editor of the Journalist Resource. The Journalist Resource is a project housed at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. And our aim is really simple. The Journalist Resource is working to bridge the gap between journalism and academia. And we do that in a variety of ways. We're providing resources, we're creating tip sheets. We're trying to help journalists find and use high quality evidence, namely in the form of academic research, and then explain it to a lay audience. A few logistical things before we get started, just so everyone's aware. So if you have a question, and I encourage questions, if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature to ask them. I'm gonna be able to stay on afterward for additional questions if we don't get to everything, so we can get to at least some others. I will be wrapping up the session at 50 minutes because that's what I told everyone. This is gonna be 50 minutes, so I'm gonna wrap it up, but I can stay a little longer if there are extra questions. I'd like to point out that this session will be recorded and that you should keep an eye on the chat box because we'll be putting in there some tip sheets that we think will be really useful to you, that you'll find helpful. Today's plan really quickly, because we've got a ton of wonderful stuff to cover. I'm going to talk about why reporters should love academic research. I don't mean like, I don't mean think it's great. I'm talking love academic research because it is an incredible journalism tool. I'm going to share some of the best ways to find it. I'm going to talk about translating it for the public. I'll offer a number of do's and don'ts that you should keep in mind as you're looking for research, as you are explaining it, as you're figuring out how to describe its implications, its real world implications. Then I'm gonna go over some pointers that will help you gauge a good study from a questionable one. And then lastly, of course, we're gonna get to some questions. But before I begin, just so everyone is on the same page, I wanna talk about what I mean when I say academic research. So this is primarily a scientific or scholarly investigation of a trend, an issue, an idea. It's often conducted, organized by college or university faculty. It has undergone peer review. In other words, it has been vetted by an independent group of experts who have experience researching in this particular area of the field. And then it's been published in an academic journal. And then here are, I know a lot of you guys understand the value of academic research, but just so you know why it's a great idea to use it and to rely on it. You can use research to get up to speed on a topic or trend or idea, try to understand, what do we know to date about this topic, and, give you a lot of background on the issue. getting a sense of whether a policy proposal is likely to succeed or fail or have consequences that maybe a policy maker didn't intend, didn't expect. Getting ideas for other angles to pursue, other questions to ask that perhaps you didn't consider. Checking facts and figures, checking people's statements. So if a politician or a government leader makes a statement about maybe a group within the population, you can check those statements, you can check speeches, you can go back into the research and check that. Understanding how the public feels about a problem or issue. As you may know, a lot of academic research is based on surveys. So a government agency or a research entity will go out into a community or do a survey online and gather information and input on a particular issue or problem to find out how people feel or to try to measure how strongly they feel one way or the other about an issue. Also, it's really useful for understanding how our work, how journalists' work affect particular groups in our community or affect a problem. That might be, how we're portraying an issue, how we are showing maybe a group within our population in the images we run with our stories or the adjectives we use to describe people. Even though hardworking journalists, we're trying to give our best effort at accurately reporting the news and doing a good job, fairly reporting the news. Sometimes when we look at patterns in the way we cover things, researchers will be able to reveal that sometimes our habits can be harmful or at least not achieve maybe a goal we are trying to achieve. So kind of keeping that in mind. I strongly believe that academic research is fantastic for doing accountability journalism. It is easily one of journalism's best kept secrets for holding agencies accountable, whether that is a government agency, a nonprofit group, agencies in general, organizations in general, keeping politicians honest, understanding what they're talking about, being able to check out what they've said, preventing and fighting disinformation. So I'm going to go through a couple examples to kind of show you what I'm talking about, some real examples. So it makes logical sense if a lawmaker was to say, we need to increase taxes on tobacco because, we want to curb smoking among young people, young adults or teenagers. We want to get them to stop smoking. So let's boost the price of tobacco because most of them don't have a lot of money. So if we go to the research, what we're actually going to find is that sometimes what seems to make sense in terms of actions to change people's behavior it sometimes doesn't pan out. I was looking at a paper that was just published last year in PLOS ONE, which is a journal of the nonprofit Public Library of Science. And basically it finds that established smokers or young people who have smoked for a little while, that those studied actually smoked more after the tax was increased. And they gave a couple reasons for that. One being, it's likely that when people found a really good deal on cigarettes, they stocked up. And so that they were more likely, they were increasing their smoking. They also said they found evidence that tobacco manufacturers, in response to the tax increase, would offer coupons or do other things that would reduce the price of the cigarette or other form of tobacco to the price it used to be, or in some cases even lower. What the paper actually finds is that smoke-free laws are more effective across most types of smokers than the tax increase. And the authors of this study suggest that a combined approach, is best. Implementing a comprehensive smoke-free ordinance, boosting the tax, but then also establishing a minimum floor price for tobacco so that it can't go below a certain amount. Another example, I love this example because people who have covered state government, county government, local government, we're all the time seeing these economic impact studies. So a developer comes in, they have an idea, they're going to build this project, let's say it's a sports stadium, and they bring in an academic impact study with this beautiful report and a press release, and it shows that the project is going to have this gigantic impact on the area. In this example, an $150 million impact on the area. And we're like, oh, this sounds great. This is really interesting stuff. Well, let's go to the research. What does the research say about economic impact studies? Well, if you look at the research, there are a number of published studies that question the reliability of economic impact studies. And also note that government officials, the people who are running a local government, as well as the people who are elected to boards who are making decisions, they often don't have the training to detect problems in the way data is collected for these reports, how the data is analyzed, and how it's presented. So those are things to really keep in mind as you're reporting on these things. Example 3, as communities and entities wrestle with how to tackle a problem, you as a journalist can use research to help audiences understand what works or what has shown promise elsewhere in another community, another part of the country, another part of the world. For example, do students really learn more when you reduce class sizes? What kinds of public information campaigns help correct bad information about vaccines? Or what kind of campaigns actually could backfire? What initiatives actually boost voter participation? In what ways have other cities successfully reused abandoned buildings and property? What works in preventing suicide among veterans? So, lots of great questions, and the research will help talk about, what do scholars know about this topic? What is known, what works, what has shown promise? Just a really great resource for investigating these questions. Now, where do you go to find research? Where are the best places to find this stuff? Colleges and universities, research organizations, going to individual faculty. So I want to point out that if you're looking for a research study, often you can go to the college or research organization. They might have a public affairs or a public relations team that will have studies that they will give you for free. Many times colleges and research organizations will post a copy of a published study on their website too. You can go to individual faculty. They also oftentimes will provide copies of a research paper on their individual faculty pages. But also if you reach out to them and say, hey, this is a study I'd really like to read, but there's a paywall. I have never, ever had a researcher not share a study with me, ever tell me no. Libraries, whether that's a library located at a college or university or a public library. A lot of them have subscriptions to academic journals. Preprint collections are a great place to find research, but I want to also point out that preprint collections online, those are collections of research that has not yet gone through peer review. So it hasn't been vetted yet by an independent group of experts with experience and expertise in that topic area. So a lot of times researchers will want to get the information, their findings out to the public quickly, because the peer review process and the journal publication process can take months to a year or more. So great place to find research, but be cognizant that it hasn't been vetted yet and that you should probably give it a lot of scrutiny. Google Scholar, great place to find research. It's a search engine that lets you search by topic or date, key terms. Another Oh my goodness, sorry about that. Went backwards. Another great place, whoops, is academic journals themselves. Now I know that there are some journalists who are hesitant to go to the academic journals directly because of the paywalls. But I want to point out that a number of them, especially the bigger academic journals, they will allow journalists who ask for permission, they will give you free access to journal articles. So some journalists don't realize that, but absolutely you ask and they'll give it to you. But in addition to all these other ways, going to the individual faculty, going to the library, that kind of stuff, a growing number of academic journals are either allowing some articles to be open access, meaning they're available to anybody who wants to read it, or a growing number of academic journals themselves are open access, meaning everything that they have is open to anyone who wants to read it. Now, I use Google Scholar a lot. That is often my first place, or one of my first places to go when I'm looking for research on a topic. And here's why. So it's free. You can go in and use it. It's a search engine that indexes research. It's super easy to use. Often they offer free copies of academic research. So they'll either provide a free copy of the published version, or sometimes they will link to a copy that is the most recent copy before it was published. And that's great to have, but you should also check in with the authors to ask them, how close is this copy to the published version? Because sometimes there are changes. Sometimes it's exact, but sometimes there are a few or more changes before publication. And then not often, Google Scholar does offer citation numbers, which for journalists is a great measure of reliability. A citation number reflects how often other scholars have cited this research in their work. And then Google Scholar also lets you create alerts so you can keep tabs on new stuff that's published. So a few really, really important tips about academic journals. Some of them focus on a very specific subject. Criminology, for example, examines research in the criminal justice field. The review of educational research examines research around education. New England Journal of Medicine around health and medical topics. There are some journals that publish research on an array of topics like social problems, the proceedings of the National Academy of Science, also known as PNAS, and they publish a lot of research in the hard sciences and in the social sciences. So they're doing a little bit of everything. What I want to make sure you understand is that if you only check certain journals, you're going to miss something. If, for example, you cover criminal justice and you completely ignore, for example, the review of educational research, you're going to miss out on research that, say, looks at crime on campus, or young people, people under 18, arrests and disciplinary issues that you probably will be interested in. So just keep that in mind, that they all cover a lot of really interesting stuff. And if you only stick to a few, you're going to miss some things. I'm going to next offer you a number of tips that I think are going to go far to help you understand research, but then not make some really common errors. Tip number one is don't ever assume that research is going to be bulletproof, that is guaranteed to be high quality just because it comes from a prestigious university or a prestigious research organization. All research needs to be scrutinized. It is not a guarantee that this study is amazing. Tip number two, don't spend too much time on the abstract. And I stress this, especially for journalists who are on daily deadlines. So the abstract is going to be the paragraph or a few paragraphs at the very beginning of a research article that offer a summary of what the authors believe are the big takeaways of their study, their key findings. What you may know and need to know is that often what a researcher thinks are the key takeaways are not always what a journalist is going to think are the key takeaways or the most interesting or compelling findings. So often, as I tell people, if you're looking for those gold nuggets, those golden nuggets, they're inside. I often will not even read the conclusion. I might breeze through it, but the conclusions are often kind of just, broad general statements about the bigger findings. If you want the details, you're going to go into two sections. One is called results, and that's where the authors are analyzing the data, talking about how they went about analyzing the information, what they've learned, and then the discussion goes into a lot of details about what they found, what the information revealed, and oftentimes, the real world implications of what they learned through this investigation. Tip number 3, look for limitations. So as you're describing a research paper's findings to your audiences, you have to make sure you're keeping these limitations in mind. And it's important to know that good researchers will go out of their way to point out the shortcomings of their work and the potential biases in their work. From the way the study was designed, to the way data was collected, to the way it was analyzed, how it was used in their papers, and what shortcomings and biases exist in their findings also. That's really important context. Tip number 4, this is a big one. If it is not clear who is affected by the findings, if it's often hard to tell, and if it's not immediately clear, do not make assumptions. Go to the authors and ask them, who is affected by this? Are the findings generalizable to a larger group, to a larger populations? For example, if you're reading a study that's focusing on teenagers, so they've done a study, that looks at teenagers and they say, this is what we learned about this. Does what they learned, do the findings apply to only the teenagers that are in that sample? Like, for example, a specific community? Does it apply to teenagers in urban cities of a certain size? What about certain states? Maybe it's only, maybe the findings only apply to teenagers in 3 states that were studied. Does it apply nationwide? Does it apply globally? Don't make assumptions. If it's not crystal clear, and often it is clear, make sure to go to that author and get some clarification before you, say, all teenagers are affected by this thing. Tip number 5, be careful about inferring causation. Just because something changes in the presence of something else doesn't mean that one thing caused the other to happen. And I use this next sentence. I used it a lot when I was trying to make sure that I accurately characterized study findings, and I share it often with other journalists to help them keep in mind what I mean when I say that because something is correlated, it doesn't mean there's causation. If ice cream sales spike at the same time that hospitals are reporting more water skiing injuries, that doesn't mean that ice cream causes water skiing injuries. Tip number 6. This is a big one that I really want to make sure I point out, because I made this mistake all the time in the newsroom and I'm very embarrassed. I don't want you guys to do it. Significant, the word significant in a research article does not mean something is noteworthy. If you read that the researcher has found this finding to be significant, that doesn't mean this is a big deal, this is noteworthy. You got to make sure you point this out in your article or your coverage. Researchers characterize something as significant because it is statistically significant. In other words, it has passed a mathematical threshold. So please don't make that same mistake. Tip number 7. We're smart people. A lot of us know this, but it is definitely worth repeating because mean and median, some people get them mixed up. So mean and average are the same thing, but median is that number in the middle. So if you've got, a bunch of data, the very middle number is going to be the median. Tip number 8, do not report, do not put this in your lead, don't put it in your headlines. Don't say unless the researcher explicitly states it in the paper, or when you call them or email them, they actually confirm that it's true. Don't say this study proves something. Don't say the study shows this thing causes this, because in all likelihood, those are going to turn out to be inaccurate statements. If a researcher finds that something proves something or causes something, they generally explicitly state it in their paper. They'll say, for example, they'll either say this thing caused this, or they'll say, we found causal evidence, or we have reason to believe there is causation. So they'll use language like that. Tip number 9, and this is my last big tip I want to share with you, is reach out to the author. Research academics and research people are an incredible source, an incredible resource for journalists. So not only are they going to be able to explain, what the study does and does not say, and let me emphasize that it is important to know what a study does not say so that you're not inferring something or making an assumption based on your reading of a study. They can talk about what are the real world implications of the findings. They can talk about, what are some questions this research raises that maybe you as a journalist didn't think about? What are some angles that need examining that perhaps the news media it isn't looking at, that you haven't thought about? And then who else should you be talking to? They're really good about having information that'll help you in that way. Here is a list of indicators of quality that I put together with some help with some other academic scholars around the country. These, I will start by saying that these are individually, they're great ways to gauge research quality, but it doesn't mean, it's not a guarantee, so to speak. So think of this as if you find a research paper and it checks all of these boxes, the chances are good that you're looking at a good piece of research. But think of this list as more of a safety belt, that chances are great it's going to be good, but it's not guaranteed. So number 1, it's published in a peer-reviewed journal. We know that this doesn't guarantee quality, and that peer-reviewed journals vary in terms of quality and the rigor of their peer review process. But if it's published in a peer-reviewed journal, that's an indication it's gone through a vetting process. If it appears in a top journal, often top journals, they have a more rigorous peer review process and publish the best research on given topics. The authors of the paper have expertise in the narrow area subject topic of the study, and they also have a history of publishing on the topic. The researchers don't have conflicts of interest. They don't stand to gain something financially or otherwise. They don't stand to gain from the findings in some way. The paper presents all the data. So they're looking at, here's where we got the data. They're listing where they got it, what years they're using, and then the statistical models that they use to look at the data and reach their findings. The study goes out of its way to explain its limitations. The findings are supported by data. So when you're reading the conclusion, when you're reading the results, when you're looking at the discussion session, what they're saying they learned is backed up by the data they're using. And then if you're looking for a really great piece of research known as a meta-analysis or a meta-study. So these are essentially, meta-analyses and meta-studies are essentially a study of the studies that exist previously, that have been done previously on a topic. And they really are great for bringing together a bunch of information together, but they are among the most reliable forms of research. Now, this is a short list of reasons that a journalist should cause for pause. Now, this does not mean that the research is bad at all. It basically means you should stop and give this research more scrutiny. So if you come across a study that's from an advocacy group or a partisan group that probably in some ways could stand to gain from the findings of a piece of research, you're going to give that more scrutiny. Studies from someone who stands to gain from the findings, obviously give that more scrutiny. Studies that are old, and I want to stress here that old is relative. So if you come across a piece of research and the analysis is based on data from a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago, that doesn't mean that's a bad study. That actually could mean it could be a fantastic study. For example, maybe that is the most recent data on the issue, or maybe this is a study that looks at this information in a way that hasn't been done before. And for those reasons, it's very relevant. What I mean when you're looking at a study that's old is, so let's say a study was done a decade ago, and it looks at something related to technology, like maybe social media. You're going to want to take a really close look at that because the findings may not be relevant to current day. So, use that as a measure of when to pause. Studies that exaggerate or minimize findings, those for obvious reasons you want to pay more attention to. And studies that don't explicitly point out their limitations, their shortcomings, their biases. If they don't point them out, and they need to, that is a big cause for pause. Before I wrap up, I want to point out that we are going to be sharing some of our tip sheets, the ones that we thought would be really helpful to those of you who are interested in, becoming more versed in some of the jargon, some of the research terms, the way that research is presented. So these are some tip sheets we thought could be really helpful to you. All of our written materials are free, so we've got a lot more than this, and I really encourage you to check it out. I want to highlight that I do include one piece at the top that's not technically a tip sheet. The one that looks at Tampa Bay Times reporters looking at predictive policing. So there was a group of 2 reporters, actually, I'm sorry, I think it was a reporter and an editor who put together a series on predictive policing. It's spectacular. It's spectacular. And actually after this ran, it went on to win a Pulitzer Prize in local reporting. But what is really awesome about this piece is that the reporter that I interviewed, I noticed that they use research a lot in the series, that it really plays a strong role. And I wanted to talk to him about, the practical ways that he used research to learn about the topic and to use it actually as a part of the reporting process in terms of interviewing, and then also as a way to hold people accountable. And he used it as a way to report, to interview, to investigate, and then just to kind of report out the story and fill in holes in questions raised. So he does a really good job of kind of laying out some of the tips that he would offer if journalists were to ask him, or if he were speaking to a group of journalists. So please be on the lookout for those tips. Before I go into questions, please check us out, Journalist Resource. We are an awesome resource for journalists who are looking for tips on how to use research, tips on how to cover certain policy topics. We have collections of research on the kinds of newsy policy topics we know you're covering, we know you're interested in. So check those out. You can follow us on Twitter. We're always promoting our materials, older ones that people have loved and use, as well as new content that we've just created. You can sign up for our weekly newsletter. It goes out once a week. And we also, in the newsletter, will promote new stuff and stuff that we think will be helpful for that week, or for, in the near future. And then my email address right there, you have a question, you want to chat some more, I welcome you to reach out to me. Always happy to talk about research because I love it, and I would like everyone to think it's as exciting and as useful as I do. So please hit me up. All right. We are ready for some questions, and I know you all have lots of them.
Yes.
So, Lindsay.
Yes, we've got a lot of great questions in. So here's the first one. Often studies will conclude with a statement along the lines of more research needs to be conducted. If reporters use only one study that support their hypothesis, aren't they doing the same things as politicians who are pushing an agenda? Do reporters need to do a meta-analysis on every topic for which they are using studies?
So what I would say is that yes, that focusing on one single study, I caution you against that. And if you do want to focus on a single study, I urge you to do a couple of things. One is try to put that study into context in terms of what is known more broadly about that topic. And you can do that a number of ways. One would be if you're on deadline, maybe you have a scholar who you have developed as a source who has expertise in this area. Call that person up and get them to talk about, have they read this and what do they think about it, and what are the shortcomings, and what does this study actually say, and what does it not say, and get them to help provide that context, so that you're not just saying, here's a study that finds this one thing, and you're only looking at that one study in a vacuum, because you really need to look at it in the larger context of the scholarship in general. I wouldn't expect a journalist to do a meta-analysis or a lit review, although that is awesome. If you have the time to do that, absolutely. You want to understand what's known out there. But on a number of policy topics, meta-analyses and literature reviews do exist. And those are useful because people who know how to use research, people who do research, people who know this topic backwards and forwards, they have personally gone in and done the analyses and are able to explain, the research today, this is what we do know and have a high confidence in. These are areas where we're not certain, or the level of certainty isn't clear, or there's so many questions that still remain to be answered, and they'll talk about that. And they also, within the lit review and the meta-analyses, they also, as they're explaining what we know and the findings, they often do a really good job pointing out the strengths and weaknesses of what prior research, of the prior research. Like the prior research, it's flawed because it doesn't look at this question in this way. Or, these two studies are particularly strong because of these reasons. So those are other reasons that a meta-analysis, which is also known as a meta-study, are so very useful to journalists. Yes, so just, if you're going to write about a single study, be very clear to help your audience understand that this new information doesn't come in a vacuum, that it's a step that builds upon earlier research, and that you really got to understand what exists as a whole and put that into context. So I hope that's really helpful.
How can you trust the reliability of the study and the journal? How do you know if the journal is reputable?
That's a really good question. I get that question a lot. So if we're talking about study reliability, I would go back to those bullet points and look at those and see if you can check those off, because that's going to, like I said, that's going to help give you some confidence in the study. Excuse me. If you're looking at a journal, that is a really hard question, because there are so many journals out there, and they vary widely in terms of the rigor of their process and the kind of research they take in. And I will point out that, the very top journals, people go to them for a reason. They are more careful. They tend to be more careful in their vetting process. They tend to publish the highest quality stuff, but also lesser known journals. Sometimes there'll be like an amazing study that's very high quality that will be rejected or not even be submitted to one of these very top journals, because the chances are not great they'll get in because of maybe the narrowness of the scope of the research, that will appear in a much lesser known journal, but it is really great stuff. So don't assume just because a journal is small or not well known that the research in there is not going to be great. This is a very, very complex issue. There's no easy answers in terms of how do I know beyond a doubt this is a high quality journal. What I would recommend would be a couple of things. Go to the top research organizations for your beat topic or the topic you're really interested in, and talk to them about what are the journals they rely on, what are the journals they look to when they're looking at research. Another one, go to the faculty who you've developed as sources who have expertise in this field, and ask them, what do you consider the top journals? Which are the journals that you go to often for research on that topic that you find reliable and high quality? And then there's another way, another gauge is journals are given impact scores. So this is a flawed measure of reliability, because it only captures certain information, but an impact score will look at how often the information in that journal is cited in other research. So that isn't always the best gauge, but it is an indicator that you can use to gauge reliability and quality.
If you're not strong in statistics, how can you tell the data has found what the authors said it found? In other words, how can a non-stats person know the books weren't cooked?
Really, really, really good question, because a lot of journalists don't have training in statistics, or they might have a cursory level of training, maybe in undergrad or in grad school. So my advice would be, well, go to people who do. Go to the people who do have expertise in statistics. And that might be going to one of the authors. And that is often what would be my first stop. Go to the authors and have them explain it. Go to a researcher or a faculty member who has expertise in this issue, and go to them and say, you probably read this, or if you haven't read it, would you mind checking it out? And have them go over and have them look at it, look at the data, and they'll be able to kind of give you their opinion of what the data shows and doesn't show, and whether the authors accurately characterized what the data finds. Another good resource, there are some organizations that exist out there that help journalists specifically on stats issues. Not just reading statistical models, but also making sure that they are accurately interpreting them, so that when they explain it to their audiences, what they say was found was actually found. The two organizations that I can think of off the top of my head that can help in this issue is, oh my goodness, I just lost them. Sideline is a great resource. They are out there to help journalists get in contact with experts. And then, oh my goodness, I am completely blanking. I will, whoever is answering this question, if you could please follow up with me and I can help. But there's another really great organization.
There are great suggestions in the chat as well.
Okay, oh, great.
IRE.journalism.com.
There's an organization that actually is part of the American Statisticians Association or something. It's a group of statisticians who are on call for journalists who need help in statistics. They are math people, and that's what they do. And they're just waiting for journalists to call them and get some help. So they exist out there. They exist. So hopefully, that's another resource you can go to. There's lots of help. I don't think people expect journalists to be experts in statistics, but absolutely statistics, you need to have a good statistics knowledge to really understand the data and whether the data show what the results the results capture what the data actually say.
Do you have any tips for how to identify conflicts of interest?
Sure. So actually, a number of journal articles upon publication, they will have notes at the bottom indicating whether conflicts of interest exist. And then they will sometimes outline, even go into detail about those either conflicts of interest or possible conflicts of interest. So that's a good way to go about it. Some other things I would probably try, you might want to, look at the journal authors and put them in Google Scholar and look at other research. And let's say you identify a piece of research you want to write about and it doesn't outline conflicts of interest, it doesn't even mention it. You could go to other articles that have been published in other journals and see if it shows up there. So that's a good way to do it. Also, you could talk to other researchers and they may know. So those are kind of the first steps I would take. Go to other journals, look at the journals, see what they have to say, and then other researchers in the field, because they often know each other or know of each other. And that could be a way to also identify some things worth looking into.
How would you recommend a journalist check that the academic or scientific jargon is accurately translated to be useful / understandable to a non-expert audience?
So I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that question. How are you sure that the language they may be recommending you use in your article is actually language that a lay public would understand?
I'm not sure whether this person's a journalist or an academic, but I interpret it as, when you're writing about an academic piece, how do you make sure that your audience can understand, and that it's not too jargony?
So the suggestion I'm going to make is what I did when I was in the newsroom. And I made it very clear when I would call a researcher or an academic, and I would just say, look, I don't know everything about this topic, and I'm not going to try to make you believe that I know everything. Can you please explain this in a way that an 8th grader would understand? And that would also always prompt a chuckle. But if you can explain it to an 8th grader, the chances are that you'll be able to explain it to the lay public in a way, the journalist will take that information and hopefully if it's explained at that level, the journalist will understand it so that they can convey the information in a way that their audience, audiences vary, but their specific audience would understand. So I often looked at things that way. I worked for a daily, that was a regional newspaper. That was my last newsroom. And I always tried to write in a way that someone who was an 8th grader or 9th grader could understand. because this research stuff is really hard to understand for most people. And if you don't keep it simple, you're going to lose interest, but then people are, it's going to go over their head. It is tough stuff. But also, you know what, also what I would do sometimes when I was writing, if it was a topic that was really complex, and or if it was complex and I knew it well because it was on my beat, I would go to other colleagues, like other journalists in the newsroom or my editor, and go, if I say something this way, do you understand it? If I said it this way, would your wife understand it? Or, do you think that most people in this community would understand it? So you kind of like run it by other people. That could give you a gauge of the understandability of what you're writing. I hope that's helpful. Lindsay, does that sound like an answer to the question?
I think so.
Okay. If I don't, if you ask that question or you ask other questions, if I didn't answer your question or you need some clarification, please reach out to me. I encourage you to. I love to talk about research, and I'm happy to help you.
I think we have time for just a couple more.
Okay.
So how do corporate donations to universities/centers affect research, and how do you take that into account when reading studies?
So I'm going to right away say that I think that it's probably going to vary. And I can't speak for every university, every entity, organization, because they're going to handle things differently. What I can say is that, you should probably have a conversation with that organization or pull up their policies and rules to find out, do donors have any kind of influence? If you're reporting on a lot of colleges and universities, they should have policies for what role, if any, donors are going to have in the research process. Anything from like what questions to ask, to design, to coming up with ideas for where to go to find participants. You're going to obviously want to limit any outside participation in a scientific inquiry. And I would think that most would have a policy that outlines, whether they even get a say or whether they even play a role in the work. Did I answer the question? How do you know what role they play? You look for what their policies are. Public universities, it's often much easier to get that information from them than from a private university. But that's the kind of information that I think they probably wouldn't have a problem sharing. What are their rules for going through this process, and how do they handle donors? That's important stuff. That another good way that you might find that information, like let's say you get an entity that doesn't want to share it, you might look for like federal grant applications and seeing whether that kind of information is shared on there. Grant applications for research is a great way to look for really important, interesting stuff. And so that could be a place where you could find some insights on that too.
Here's another one. How can we ensure diversity in the coverage of research? Where can we go to find journals that might publish papers from researchers of color who have barriers to getting published in the top journals?
So a couple of things I would do. Let's see, what would I do? One of the first things I would do was, so on my beat, I tried to, because I was always very cognizant about wanting to get different voices into my coverage. I knew, who were, 3 or 4 researchers who could speak about topic A, and 3 or 4 or 5 researchers who could talk about topic B. And then I would try to, not always rely on someone, or make sure to have, diversify voices and perspectives on issues. But if I wasn't clear, so I'm going into a topic that maybe I don't know a lot about it. I don't know who the researchers are. I maybe don't know a lot of academics in that area. Let's see, how would I try to find diverse voices? Well, I would go to colleagues and I would ask them. I would go, so you could go to someone else in the newsroom. You could go to, maybe there's a listserv for journalists on your beat. You could go to an organization that represents journalists on a specific topic area. It might be IRE, Education Writers Association. What are some other there's I'm gonna forget. There's a group of business journalists. I'm not remembering their name off the top of my head. Those organizations probably know, right? Can point you in the direction of different researchers who have expertise in that area. So those are good ways to do it. Let's see. I'm not familiar with an entity that will say, if you're looking for a scholar who is a racial or ethnic minority who can speak on this, here's a list. I'm not familiar with a resource like that. But I do know if you call academics, they'll know, they know each other. They'll know other people that you could call if you're looking for a perspective from, like I said, a researcher who is a racial or ethnic minority, or a researcher who has a different socioeconomic background, or a researcher who comes from maybe has a different religious or faith tradition. So, they know a lot about each other, and that would be a great resource too. Just call up someone or an academic that you don't know and say, I'm a journalist and I'm trying to diversify voices. I'm trying to find different perspectives. Who would be good to call if I'm looking to do that? Who would you recommend? I have found researchers to be super helpful in terms of whether I email them or I call them, to help the public better understand the issues that they're really passionate about. So I hope that was helpful. I kind of rambled there, but I hope that I was able to give you some helpful insights.
Last question. A lot of folks have been asking if they'll have access to your slides from today's presentation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can reach out to me and I can share them, or I can work with my team to see if we can post it somewhere publicly, whether that might be on our website or somewhere. We'll make sure you have access to it, even if it's like, you reach out to me and I can share it with you. I have no problem sharing it with anyone who wants to see it. I have no problems posting it online for the public to see. But also I encourage you to please check out those tip sheets, because they go into a lot more depth in terms of the issues that I touched on as part of this presentation.
Great, thank you, Denise.
Holy smokes, it's already 1 o'clock. Wow. Okay, I think we're gonna hard stop here. If you have questions, again, before we close down, please reach out to me. Happy to answer your questions. A lot of your questions probably will be answered by our tip sheets, which are free. Everyone can use them and share them. I encourage you to please check journalistresource.org out and to sign up for our newsletter, which goes out every week. Thank you.